For more on this, I'm joined by Michelle Weise. She's a senior research fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute. Her specialty is in disruptive innovation in higher education. So, first of all, welcome back. This is basically perfect. I mean, this is disruptive because it's free. Am I right?
So a lot of people like to use the term disruptive innovation when they see a really interesting kind of technological advancement, and they think that this is a disruption to what we're typically used to. But usually you actually have to have certain markers in place for us to call something a disruptive innovation. And in the case of a massive open online course, free is not necessarily that marker, even though it's a really wonderful way of democratizing education potentially. What you have to have are sort of the right kinds of consumers, the right kinds of technologies, combined with a right business model. And so there have been certain parts of those that have been, certain markers that have been missing for MOOCs so far, but I think they're starting to try to develop some of those, and they've realized that, you know, maybe our target demographic are those working adults who maybe are trying to skill up for a certain vocation or certain change in careers, and so they're starting to strategically bundle their courses in different ways.
So here's a business question. Harvard's doing it. That's great. What if the other 1,000 universities across the country, they all have a similar program where all the professors are all doing some sort of free stuff online? There simply is not enough eyeballs to go around, right? I mean, at some point, you're only going to gravitate towards a field. You have to differentiate yourself.
Yeah, so I think what's important is it's not just that there's going to be, you know, one professor teaching biology. There may be, you know, there may not be 1,000 teaching MOOCs online in biology. But what MOOCs have done for higher education is that they've shown that content doesn't need to be proprietary. And in fact, pedagogy can change around content that you can access from anywhere. So even if there were, say, 7 or 8 algebra or calculus or anthropology courses online that were available for free, what would be interesting is to see the way in which instructors make that content come alive in the classroom. And there's this actually just an amazing program even in Rwanda, in Kigali, that is taking some of those massive open online courses, combining them with something called online competency-based education, and helping impoverished students actually get jobs using all of that online content. It
really truly is amazing. We've talked about this issue a number of times, but when you think about some of the challenges developing countries have, this certainly serves as a platform for resolving a lot of those challenges. Now, one thing that was brought up in today's meeting when we talked about this segment was, you know, obviously this is not going to replace the human-to-human interaction if you and I, for example, were in a class and working on a project. But how can they make the online education part of it as similar as possible as if we were actually in the same room together?
So I think when people try to compare a traditional classroom experience with an online classroom experience, they often set up a false dichotomy, or they'll say that there's nothing that can replace that human in-person interaction. But there's also a different side of the coin, which is that there are some things that online technologies can actually do sometimes better than that in-person interaction. If you just sort of think about it in terms of when a professor is in front of the classroom, even leading like a small discussion section, they often don't know what the quiet person in the back is thinking, or whether they're struggling with the material or whether they're bored by the material. There are new kinds of advancements going on, and not just in MOOCs, but in different versions of online education, where you can actually see through an online dashboard using all of the clicks. It's all of this data that's kind of analyzing the different clicks and understanding how students are participating with all of the different pieces of content, the exercises, the different assessments online, to see where they're struggling and where they may need some interventions or some help from a tutor. So there are ways in which we can understand student learning even better sometimes through those online technologies, and people tend to dismiss that element and say, well, there's nothing better that will, you know, that will compete with my in-person interaction. Well, there's sometimes actually some limits to what we can actually do when we're in the classroom.
Well, I mean, speaking of limits, I'm going to be dating myself here, so my apologies, but I didn't have email when I went to university, so we didn't have this problem. So I imagine in today's cases, does this ultimately help the students learn, I guess, faster? Am I saying that right?
Well, yeah, so there's this term that we call self-paced, where sometimes students may need a little bit more time to struggle with the material before they've mastered it and can move on. And so there is freedom there and flexibility there for certain students. And so I think that's a really important element to bring to bear, so that students can really make sure they understand the material before moving on. And sometimes that means, taking a few weeks, and then sometimes they can actually blow through the material really quickly when it comes so easily to them. They don't need to prove that they know something.
They don't have to
just by
follow along
sitting
with the entire
16
class
weeks.
anymore. They can kind of go at their own pace, basically.
Exactly.
Absolutely
Exactly.
fascinating, and yes, it's disruptive. So, Michelle Weise, thank you very much. Excellent discussion. Have a great weekend.